Welcome to Real Gem Radio. I'm Danny Leroux, your host, and so happy to be with you for this episode. This is one that has been in the works for a little while. I've been wanting to talk to Royce Young of ESPN about the experience of covering the Oklahoma City Thunder this year and also where they're going. And so we go through all of that in about a 55-minute conversation, and I really did enjoy it. This episode is sponsored by Blue Apron, the amazing food delivery service. You can go to blueapron.com/realgm and you can get your first 3 meals free, including free shipping, by going to that URL. Again, blueapron.com/realgm. Thanks so much for coming on.
You bet.
I wanted to have you on because I just thought this was such a fascinating season, beginning to end, top to bottom, for the Oklahoma City Thunder. You know, it started just a little bit less than a year ago with everything that happened. And we'll get into some of the specifics in a minute, but just like you were around this team closely this entire year and have the full context of your previous time with the team. What do you take away from the experience?
Yeah, it was amazing, Danny. I mean, it really was. Because I think that people have to, you know, like you kind of referenced, you have to put yourself in the frame of mind of the way the fan base, the franchise, the city, the state all felt when they woke up on July 5th, 2016, and Kevin Durant was suddenly no longer part of the franchise. And then if you could sit people down, I think, for lunch on that July 5th, and you say, okay, here's what's going to happen. Russell Westbrook's going to sign an extension, and he's going to average a triple-double and maybe win MVP. Like, I think, and you're still going to win 8 fewer games than you did the year before, and you're going to go to the playoffs, and you're going to be a 6th seed in the Western Conference. I think people would be like, okay, get out of town. That sounds so unrealistic and stupid. It's like you get caught up into the present moment, and you kind of forget about the way that you felt when you were starting to set those expectations for yourself. You know, you just like let expectations fly out the window when the reality becomes what it is. And I think that, you know, watching this season with Westbrook especially, there was some really, really rough edges, as you know, Danny. I mean, it was not pretty all the time, and the Thunder roster has a lot of questions. I think Westbrook himself has a lot of questions to kind of answer and evaluate going forward. But for what it was, you know, moving on from a foundational, transcendent Hall of Fame player, in my opinion, you know, maybe I think Kevin Durant's the best offensive player in the world, and to kind of move on from that to then saying, okay, what happens now? And for it to, you know, Westbrook to pick up the baton and say, I got this, and to produce the kind of season that he did, whether people want to downplay his rebounds or they want to look at contested shots and all that type of stuff, the guy did something amazing, and he changed the narrative in Oklahoma City completely from what it was back in July, where the franchise was on fire and everybody wondered what was going to happen. Would there even be a professional sports franchise in Oklahoma City in 10 years? Kevin Durant left. How could this place possibly continue to exist? And, I think that for everything that happened within the context of this one isolated season, I think a lot of people in Oklahoma are going to maybe look back on it 10, 15 years from now and maybe say it was their favorite season ever, just considering the circumstances.
I can totally understand why. And being a fan, being a media member are really complicated because you're kind of you're involved with the team in a different way. You kind of see it through their eyes and through everything else. And as those changes happen, you know, Durant leaves and everything else that happens. And I think there are 2 parts of this that are also important to get in at the outset. One is they lost Durant without compensation.
Right.
This is not even like when Cleveland lost LeBron because the CBA was different then. They at least got some first-round picks out of it. Toronto got some for Chris Bosh. OKC, because of the reaction to that with the 2011 CBA, and then of course now there's going to be a new one, they got nothing. And so to be able to do that, they didn't have a ton of flexibility. It was always this risk, but you know, it was a justifiable risk. From
a risk worth taking.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the second part was how the Thunder were consistently interesting and consistently relevant. And I didn't think they were going to reach that double this year.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that really resides in Westbrook. Westbrook is such a fascinating, polarizing player that, you know, you not only do you feel like you can evaluate every game he plays, but you feel like you can almost evaluate every possession that he plays. I mean, there's something that guy produces that you want to talk about. You just gravitate towards him. But, you know, within that, you know, he became kind of this, you know, gravitational star where he's like everything's just pulling in the direction of Westbrook. And so therefore then, like you said, Danny, so many questions and so many interesting things pop up about the Thunder about like, well, how good could they be? Could you build a title contender around Russell Westbrook, as an alpha dog? Could you what do these other pieces look like? What does their future look like? Hey, wow, they have the third youngest roster in the NBA this year. So like so many of these like things kind of become more and more relevant to where, all of a sudden the narrative changes from the Thunder franchise is a pile of ashes and there's nothing left to even pay attention to now suddenly it's like, wow, they have, if you're looking at, maybe bright futures ahead, you could maybe place the Thunder in that conversation. Now, as we all know, they have serious roster questions and serious roster flaws. And they had a team that was built to complement Westbrook and Durant as a tandem, and you remove Durant from that equation, and suddenly a lot of those specialists that they have on the team don't really complement Westbrook in the same way. And so, and I think that was the other big question too throughout the season, Danny, is that like people kind of were wondering, is it like it was a chicken or the egg type of deal? Like, is Westbrook stunting their growth and these players aren't necessarily producing to the level that they should, and rising above? Or is it that what Westbrook is doing is out of necessity to just drag this team that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to the place that they got him to? And like you said, I think that all that type of stuff is what made the Thunder interesting throughout the year.
It's almost always impossible to separate those kind of questions because you can't get them in other contexts. Like even Victor Oladipo, he played in Orlando last year, he played on the Thunder, so that's not, you can compare a little bit there, but it's still very different. Steven Adams, I think this was his most efficient year, even if it wasn't what we all thought he was going to be in the playoffs, when he was great in the 2016 playoffs, but that gets into a whole lot of other complicated stuff. And Westbrook being what he was, being the king of usage, setting I think he set the NBA record for it, but then also being their entire offensive engine in crunch time allowed Billy Donovan to go to some of these lineups where it was basically just a bunch of talented, energetic, but low usage defense first players. And this gets into one of the core arguments for me for MVP is that you can't do that approach without Russell Westbrook.
Right. The Thunder basically, they didn't just like embrace hero ball. They like built a system, into the pure fabric of hero ball. It's like Billy Donovan was like saying that this is a hero ball to the most incredible extreme. And they basically like their season hinged on Westbrook and, how he performed in those moments. And that's, that was really what swung myself too. The triple-double record and all that stuff is remarkably amazing, and it matters, I think, in the whole context of it. But you look at what Westbrook did, and some people might say, well, it's random chance that the shots went in. Those crunch time numbers are sometimes a little bit wonky and a little noisy. But here's the fact of the matter, Danny. They went in. The ball went in, and they won the games as a result of it. So whether or not it was somewhat random or noisy or whatever it might be, Westbrook hit the shots. They made the plays. They won games that they maybe otherwise shouldn't have. And I do think Billy Donovan kind of stumbled upon, whether it was intentionally so or it was just the product of just Westbrook himself, of, kind of a new style of play. The Rockets did it to a similar degree, but just not as extreme as the Thunder, of saying, look, this is Russell Westbrook is a player that plays with the ball in his hands. And the Thunder, instead of trying to say, well, let's develop a system that doesn't really embrace it, they just said, that's what we're going to be. We're going to be a team that the ball is in his hands. That's the way he plays. That's the way he's always wanted to play. And we're just going to completely wrap both arms around this and build a system around it. And so in the 34 to 36 minutes that he plays a night, the ball is going to be in his hands, and the entire offense is going to be at his will and his mercy. And I think for better or for worse, it worked kind of well at times. When Westbrook, I think, found his kind of distribution mentality and let that kind of feed into his scoring mindset, I thought the Thunder were really, really solid on the offensive end. But the other times where it kind of went the other way, Westbrook's always been somewhat of a low efficiency player, and he got in his own way at times. So I think that overall, Westbrook in some ways kind of redefined this new position of he's this high usage player, but not in, usage is kind of a complicated stat. It's it suggests a level of ball hoggery, but Westbrook was just running an offense entirely through himself. And so, like, instead of just like, the Lakers like posting Shaq over and over and over and over again or something like that, it was just a point guard, and the offense completely flowed through him in every possible manner.
Right. And the NBA, for reasons that I don't have access to, they have chosen and continued to choose to make their most prominent award a regular season most valuable player award.
Right.
So those who say, oh, well, blankety blank is a better player or whatever, that doesn't matter. That's not the award that they're giving. And if you want it to be something else, then get them to change it. And that is value. It might not be predictive, just like the Warriors were the best clutch team of all time last year and then were this year. That sort of thing happens. But it's still value. It's still something that he did, and they were able to build these lineups. And part of it that made him so valuable is that they didn't have a whole lot of other options. Like, this wasn't a circumstance where they marginalized these super talented, like give them the ball and they're going to work some magic. The Thunder didn't have a lot of those guys, and they were able to make it work. And there's a reason why players who are capable with the ball in their hands are really hard to get, because they're incredibly valuable. So they had to rely a lot on one guy. Oladipo had his moments too, but they made it work, and that's incredible.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I think that, and this is me just kind of completely speculating here, but maybe educated speculation based on knowing Westbrook and the way that he plays. But like, if you did kind of provide him, and I know I'm not stepping my toe into like, did he have help in the way that the Rockets had help? But like, if Westbrook had more of the type of players that could take the ball from him, like a Lou Williams or an Eric Gordon or whatever you want to put it as, I think that Westbrook would have adjusted to that more. I do think, to me personally, I saw it as a product of, like you said, Danny, like, what else is he supposed to do? Is he just going to post the ball to Steven Adams and with 4 minutes left in the fourth quarter? What are the Thunder's best options here? And I think that when the Thunder acquired Doug McDermott, and as Billy Donovan kind of got comfortable in figuring out how to play in the rotations, you saw some of that Houston series just in small snippets. But when Billy Donovan would put McDermott and Alex Abrinas on the floor together, Westbrook found those guys, and he looked for them often. And in some ways, Westbrook kind of mimicked the way that the Rockets played with Harden, finding shooters. It's just Westbrook had those kind of weapons around him, so he found them. And but when he didn't have that, when he was playing two traditional bigs, was with Taj Gibson and Steven Adams and pick and roll, and there wasn't a lot of space on the floor, Westbrook just became a battering ram that just tried to engineer points at the rim. And that that's what Westbrook does as well as any player in the league, is he sets up points at the rim. Westbrook is not a player that is going to pass the ball that leads to a pass that leads to a pass that gets it back. Westbrook is a player that passes it, gets it back, and attacks. And he's looking to pass to an assist. And in some ways, he's the rare breed, Danny, that I think is that he can be a selfish assister, because he's looking for a pass that directly leads to a bucket. He's not necessarily looking for a pass that just kind of runs an offense. He wants a pass that leads to a good shot, and most of the time at the rim. And because of that, I think that the Thunder offense had troubles. But then on the other flip side, it was kind of out of necessity, because like, what else is he supposed to do?
And that ties in with one of the definitive elements for me. And for those who haven't listened to it, Nate Duncan and I did a marathon podcast during the regular season about going through the MVP candidates, and we did it with fresh eyes, went through all the top four. And we both ended up with Westbrook for different reasons. But one of the big parts for me was the Thunder scored 107.9 points per 100 possessions with Westbrook on the floor. That's pretty good. That's not Solid. It's not amazing. Yeah. They scored 97.4 with him off the floor. And that gives you the idea of just how there are not other options and how tight their margins were. The reason Oklahoma City did not have a high-end offense was not because Russell Westbrook wasn't as good. I mean, his surrounding talent, I don't need to get into that argument again, but they had nothing else. And right. So that 97, that's like worse than the Sixers, worse than the Magic. Those minutes tie it down, and those are completely irrelevant to the story of like, oh, the Thunder's offense with Westbrook, but they are totally relevant to the idea of his value to the team.
Right. And I think it's point blank simply put, they beat the Rockets when Russell Westbrook was on the floor. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that they're a better team than the Rockets, because obviously that was proven out in 5 games. But when Russell Westbrook was on the floor against the Houston Rockets, the Thunder outscored them. And that was a problem that they tried to solve throughout the season. They couldn't figure it out. I think Sam Presti made, I mean, it's a weird thing to say this is one of his most egregious errors because, I mean, he did trade James Harden. But I do think that's a whole complicated, can of worms there. There's a lot of, things in context on both sides of that to try to excuse Presti on that one to some degree. But what he did with Ronnie Price in the preseason, basically the Cameron Payne broke his foot. The Thunder liked Samaje Christian. He had played overseas, played in their D League, played in their summer league. They liked the way that he was. He was a young player on a very, very cheap contract. And so Sam Presti, who had signed Ronnie Price to, I think it was a 2-year deal for $5 million in the offseason, precious cap space there on a veteran backup point guard, or really he was going to be a third-string guy. And Presti just cut him, just ate the contract and handed the keys to Samaje Christian. And, there was good reason to. Christian played pretty well in the preseason, and I'm sure that the Thunder liked him and liked kind of his story and his, from rags to riches coming from the D League and working his way up through the organization. But it proved out, I mean, the Thunder completely stunk with Samaje Christian on the floor. The guy is one of the worst offensive players in the NBA, point blank, period. He can't shoot. He can't drive. He turns the ball over at a high rate. Essentially what he became was just he'd bring the ball up and just try to post the ball to Enes Kanter. I mean, that was his role because that's what the Thunder offense was when Russell Westbrook wasn't on the floor. And the options were limited. They had a hard time developing anything. For a little brief glimpse there, Danny, I want to say, maybe I can't remember when Kanter broke his arm, but leading up to that, they had a little bit of an offensive identity with that second unit where Kanter was passing well out of double teams, and they had something going just to a small degree. And then Kanter punched a chair, and they lost all rhythm completely. But yeah, I mean, they just didn't have anything. Like you said, it all stems back to the fact that Kevin Durant left for literal nothing, and they didn't have really much cap space. What they did have, they spent on signing Westbrook to an extension. And, all free agents were gone anyway. So it was like, what do? You just got to, make the best of what you have.
And that's something that many lose sight of sometimes in the process is that not only the Thunder themselves, but the players that they theoretically could have been interested in. It's sands that are constantly moving. So right. You can't be sitting there and say, hey, we might have some money for you if Kevin Durant leaves. And then, that agent's going to be like, okay. And maybe
we'll just wait on that then.
Yeah, like, that's not the way this works. And so that's why the idea, there are various times that you could talk about this in terms of, things that could change mid off season, but they didn't have much time to react to it. And I think you saw the reason why it was smart to give Russell Westbrook that extension. I mean, it was smart for him because he got a lot more money for a pretty small commitment in terms of, just giving them an extra year. But it also gave not only the Thunder as kind of an organization, but their players and, similarly importantly, their fan base, season ticket holders, a reason to say, okay, all is not lost before the season when they found that out for sure.
Right, and there was a roadmap at that point. There was a direction. There was like a stability that gave. It wasn't a lifetime contract. It was, we all know what it was, and he has an opt-out after next season. The expectation, though, is that he's going to be eligible, unawareingly so when he signed it last summer. But now, with the new collective bargaining agreement, he's eligible for another huge extension. Expectation is he'll sign it, but. What that one last season did is it gave them it pointed them in a direction. I mean, they were a ship without a sail, and they didn't really have any, they were just out there at sea, just floating around. And Westbrook, gave them a sail and put some wind at their back, and they were suddenly going places. And they had a way to say, okay, we can start from here and then map it out from another direction. Because the interesting thing about the Thunder situation is, we're talking about a team that over a 5 6 7 year period was a true contender. Now, they didn't ever win the title. Everybody is well aware of that. But they went to 4 out of 6 conference finals. They went to an NBA finals. They had, I think, the second best record in the NBA for like a 7-year stretch behind the Spurs. So this is a team that was truly elite, and and Presti's plan was kind of coming together because he had always mapped this out for Westbrook and Durant to hit their primes together, to get signed to long-term extensions, to have money in the bank, to be able to bust into the luxury tax and re-sign young talent and keep the cupboard stocked with all these players. And the Thunder were set up to spend money. This was kind of the genesis of the Harden trade for, as negative as that has been in some ways for the Thunder. it was coming together here for Presti. If he could get Kevin Durant re-signed, most everybody you talked to in the Thunder organization, Al Horford was their next call, and they had all this money saved up ready to go do it, and then it blew up in his face, almost instantaneously. And now it's like, okay, they went from scratching the top of the mountain to now back to the middle of it, and it's kind of a rare thing, I think, in the NBA for a team to go from that point back to the middle and then to try to climb their way out of the middle without blowing it completely up. I mean, this is a really challenging spot, I think, for Presti and his staff to figure out how do you go from the middle back to the top. That's what they're going to have to try to solve this summer and the next after that.
Absolutely. Before we move on to the offseason, one other thing, I think of this as a this season question, but we'll go through a couple of different guys, and the way I like to do this is think back to where the Thunder were mid-October, beginning of the regular season, anytime in there, and do you think they should feel better or worse about? And we'll start with Victor Oladipo.
That's a good. Victor Oladipo's an interesting one, and I kind of think they should feel worse about him a little bit, but if you look at it just kind of in a snapshot view, it was his most efficient season. He dealt with a pretty severe wrist injury, and before that, he was shooting over 40% from three, shooting almost 50% from the corners. Had turned into this really, really good spot up catch and shoot guy, kind of the 3-and-D guard the Thunder had been in desperate search of for a long time, and Oladipo was providing that. I think people did kind of have this expectation for him and Westbrook to sort of form this tandem together where they were not to a degree of like a two-headed monster with like two stars, but like where Oladipo was going to be like a true supporting player, and really he just kind of was a role guy. And he's and you can get away with it this year, but next year he kicks into having an $85 million extension attached to him, and that makes you evaluate a player in a much different way. So he's still young, and I think that he showed a lot of promise this year. So I mean, in some ways I see the negative, but I also see the positive. So I'd probably just kind of say it's a push.
That's fair. And the idea that you got into in there about him maybe not being the second best player on a good team is, I think, the way that this is a negative. It looks more like he's third or fourth.
Yeah, he was supposed to be, right?
Yeah,
I mean, he was kind of supposed to be the Thunder's second best player.
Yeah, that's what they basically paid him for. And that ties in with the next one, which is Steven Adams, which I think is also a matter of perspective.
Yeah, and you mentioned it early on, Danny, and Adams himself raised his own expectations just through the roof with the way that he performed in the postseason last year. And everybody kind of saw this as, okay, now Kevin Durant's gone, and they've got this 23-year-old potential monster that blossomed in the playoffs. You put him in as Westbrook's primary pick and roll partner, and all of a sudden Steven Adams is going to be a 15-10 guy. And statistically speaking, Adams had his best year in a pretty significant way. And I do think that it's kind of a matter of perspective in some ways. I think Adams averaged 11 points, 8 rebounds or something like that. 7.8 rebounds or something. I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head. Let's just say that Russell Westbrook didn't go steal 2 free throw rebounds a game from Steven Adams, and now Steven Adams is averaging a double-double, and people might have a little bit of a different perspective of the guy just in terms of numbers. If he's averaging 11 points, 11 rebounds, people might be looking at Adams and saying, hey, he had a pretty nice little season, for being an under 25 player. But again, he's about to hit a huge extension. He's going to be a $100 million player. And, I think fans should be excited about Adams because he is a high-level defensive player. And I think that there's a lot of potential in that guy. I think that, offensively speaking, the Thunder coaching staff and the Thunder front office, they are begging Adams to evolve and kind of develop some confidence in himself offensively, because I think the guy has a lot to offer. It's just kind of about pulling it out of him. I think he just doesn't know how to play with his size quite yet. He doesn't know how to be physical. That sounds weird about Steven Adams, I know, but when he's got the ball in his hands, he just needs to like how Dwight Howard did back in 2008 and 2009, just go over people. And Westbrook and the staff is begging him to do that all the time. He's just a little tentative for some reason, but he's still young. So I think fans should be excited about Steven Adams. I think there's a lot of reason to believe in that guy.
He still has the talent that led to us all fawning over him in the 2016 playoffs. All that's still there. I don't think that what happened this year eroded it at all. It's just that we didn't see it on a game-to-game basis. So yeah, I would say for him it's lower than the playoff expectations, but this was a fine year for him. And I think that we are learning that he is probably going to be one of those lower usage bigs, but that's fine. Like for most part, you don't want high usage bigs. Not everybody can be the Karl Anthony Towns or somebody or AD. Not everybody can be that guy. And when you have a Russell Westbrook, it doesn't matter. You already have that guy.
And I think honestly, I think it takes a certain kind of player, mentally speaking, to be kind of a Westbrook player, right? And Steven Adams is the prototypical Westbrook teammate. I mean, I've never seen a player care less about numbers or anything than Steven Adams. I mean, the guy just genuinely doesn't care about anything. And he's, very low key, very chill. And, in terms of a player that can get along with Russell Westbrook, Steven Adams is like the ultimate guy at that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Before we move on to the off-season part of Oklahoma City's story, want to take a quick moment to tell you about Blue Apron, the amazing food delivery service that has become just something I look forward to every week because it is great meals to eat. I enjoy cooking it. I learn new techniques. Actually, I think it was 2 weeks ago, learned a different method for cooking burgers, for finishing them that I really enjoyed. Probably going to use that again in the future. And it provides a lot of convenience because for those of us who don't cook all the time, we might not have the full repertoire of spices and everything else, and usually you can't buy it in the perfect quantity. Not only is it pre-measured and all together with Blue Apron, but you don't have to worry about food waste. So you can eat good food, you can cook good food, and you can gain cooking confidence. And using blueapron.com/realgm, you can check out what they have on the menu for this week and going forward, and you can get your first 3 meals for free with free shipping. I did not have that much experience with Blue Apron when I started, and used that opportunity to really fall in love with the product. I found things that I was looking forward to eating, and I've gotten so much better and more comfortable in the kitchen, and I fully expect that you can be the same way. I actually get feedback from people fairly frequently saying that they really got hooked on it from Real Jam Radio in particular, and that it's become a part of their life. And if the people who have a significant other, it's a great thing that you can do together as well. So again, the URL is blueapron.com/realgm. Excellent meals, high quality ingredients, and you can get your first 3 meals for free, including free shipping. We'll move on to the offseason just because I know there's some really interesting wrinkles that I want to work through with you. And the place to start, which is so weird considering everything that we've already talked about, is with Russell Westbrook. And the reason for that is because of this nuance, as you talked about, that he didn't know when he signed his renegotiation extension, that he and former teammate James Harden were going to be grandfathered in to getting these new designated veteran extensions, even though the normal rules would prohibit that. And I understand that from a fairness perspective. If you don't know where the rule is going to go, it's not fair to punish them. And that's sort of the concept. It's actually similar to something that OKC ended up reducing their payments on Kevin Durant because the Derrick Rose rule didn't exist, but then he was subject to it. So those sorts of things as well. And the way that I'm looking at it is, if Westbrook does not agree to that extension, I would be a little bit uncomfortable because it's the same kind of boat as Durant, except that Durant never had that option just because the extension system was so broken. So if he says no, you're kind of sitting there going, well, we're taking a big risk and the return is there, but I think it'd be hard, if you're sitting there going, oh God, are we going to have to go through this again? You sit there, and I feel sympathy for the Hawks, who went through it without Horford and then did it again with Paul Millsap. Yeah, I mean, the alarm bells are just ringing out if Westbrook says no, because, there's multiple layers to this, Danny, that for one, he becomes the highest paid player in NBA history. So it's like, he's going to get his money. And, so if he doesn't want that, then that is a signal right there that, he is skeptical about the team's future. And to me, knowing Russell Westbrook and knowing what last summer's extension meant and the message that he was kind of trying to convey at that point with loyalty and commitment and all that type of stuff. And he was serious about that stuff. That was as much a part of that extension as anything else, was to kind of he made the decision to basically forego his free agency, which would have been this summer, and say, I'm giving it up because I'm making my decision now to stay in Oklahoma City. And everybody around Westbrook, everybody around the organization viewed that as a long-term commitment. And like you said there, they didn't know this was coming. They didn't know this option was coming. In their mind, Westbrook signed the 2-year extension with a player option on the 3rd year because he was trying to get to that 10-year
that 10-year marker, like a lot of players were. It's the same reason, Durant signed the 2-year deal with the Warriors. Nobody is wondering if Kevin Durant is going to go elsewhere. It's just like it was just a function of the system, and Westbrook was going to take advantage of it like everybody else. But there was no doubt that he was committed. Now this thing comes up. And after it would be different to me if the Thunder would have won 28 games and, had clear and obvious struggles and issues. But this is a 47-win team. This was a playoff team. This is a team with an upward trajectory right now. Most people, anyone you talk to, the future ahead for the Thunder looks reasonably decent. There is a path ahead, I think, to getting this team back into the conversation for the top 3 in the West. And if Westbrook says no, that to me, now you're back to the conversation you were on July 5th last year. Do you have to trade Russell Westbrook? Could a guy that wins MVP get traded before the season even starts? If Westbrook says no to this, that runs so contrary to me to everything that kind of he personally has at least publicly stood for. And I quite honestly, I view him as an incredible hypocrite to essentially build up a brand of loyalty and commitment and run as the, quote unquote antithesis of Kevin Durant, that he's, Westbrook's the guy that stayed. That's the guy that left. And now you turn down being the highest paid player in NBA history to stay with the franchise that you supposedly planted your flag with. That ain't Russell Westbrook. That ain't the guy that I know. That ain't the guy that the organization believes that they have. So if he says no to that, the alarms go off. Tornado sirens are ringing up throughout Oklahoma City, and you're talking about a trade conversation at that point.
Also, Oklahoma City's broad lack of flexibility this summer, just in terms of, they're pretty much capped out. They have their guys. They obviously have some big decisions, and we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. But he knows what they are. He knows what they're going to be. And the idea of an informed decision is already there. So if there's
not much thinking to be done. I mean, there really should.
There shouldn't be. And he also has time now to do that thinking. This is the situation. So it is a real challenge, and I don't know exactly how they're going to handle it. And as we talked about, the idea of timing is exceedingly important here.
Yeah, and I'll say this. I mean, for that exact reason, like you mentioned, Danny, to me, it's my personal expectation, and I think that it's the way that it needs to happen for Westbrook, is that it needs to be midnight July 1st. I think that like announce it. You come to you can't officially negotiate it until July 1st, like we all know, quote unquote air quotes here. But like, you need to just get out in front of it and say, like, I'm here. There's no thinking, there's no talking, there's no doing this. I'm here, and if I'm here, then this is where we build from, because that's a message. I think, the Thunder, like you said, they don't have cap space necessarily, but they do have, mechanisms to build this roster, and they're going to look to do that. They're going to try to reshape the roster around Westbrook. And in order to do that, anybody that is considering coming to Oklahoma City to play with Westbrook, they need to know that he's part of the team. And, they're going to want to know that. And for Westbrook to kind of just like dig his heels in and say, July 1st, it's over. Look, I'm here. And we're going to, do this with me running this thing. I think that that's important to do. If that drags on to like July 4th, 5th, 6th, and he's like kind of hemming and hawing over the extension, I think that that's not a good sign either.
It might not be possible, but I'm sure Sam Presti would actually prefer it if they could know a week and a half earlier, because the best way, if they were going to move Russell Westbrook, it would be more valuable to them in many ways to get picks this year, because they've already scouted those players. They already know what they're getting into, as opposed to the uncertainty that comes with future assets. Like maybe, because especially if you're trading him for future assets to a team and you're getting their players, all of a sudden they get Russell Westbrook, their team's going to be good now. So, I mean, there are teams, the Boston Celtics being one of them, that have other franchises' assets, and so maybe some of those will be good, some of those won't be. And so it would be ideal. I mean, the Thunder have already done deals in the past for players that had been drafted. I mean, that was Jerami Lamb. That was one of the most interesting things about the Harden trade, was that they traded for a player who had been drafted not on their discretion. Basically, they're just like, hey, we'll take him. He's a good player.
Yeah.
And, Jerami Lamb is doing Jerami Lamb things down in Charlotte, and you have that whole thing. But it's so interesting to be in that boat again. But that's just the way this works. And it's unpredictable. And for Sam Presti, who is one of the most meticulous planners in the world, I mean, there's just certain things like, people can, as every conversation with the Thunder and roster building goes to, you go back to the Harden trade.
Like, if people can say, like, if only he would have had the foresight to know that the cap was going to jump, and but like nobody did. Just nobody knew this. Nobody knew that this sort of thing was going to happen. And if you did, you're a liar. I mean, if you sat there and you tried to predict that the NBA salary cap was going to go to where it is right now, you just didn't know. I mean, it is a volatile landscape, and that's one of the biggest challenges there is in being a front office executive.
That also ties in. So I've previously stood by a criticism of them that they could have waited. But the problem with that I acknowledge all the time is that that's so much easier said than done. Because the idea that basically the Harden situation, they could have extended him, and then they wouldn't have actually had to deal with the luxury tax for a year and a half. If for those who want more insight on this, I wrote a long piece for the Sporting News about this. The problem with that is, and it might not have been Presti, I don't have the answer to this, is that saying that and basically committing to a future thing that you think is going to be a problem is so perilous and so like nausea-inducing that it's hard for, especially when it's real money. Like, this isn't some sort of abstract thing. You know, they would have been a luxury tax team, everything else like that. And so it's hard. And it always is going to be. I mean, you can look at some of the other situations. I mean, I was just working on my offseason preview for the Clippers. They're dealing with the same thing. You know, the Clippers, it's like, okay, we have to commit all of this money to these players, and we don't know how good we're going to be. You know, we don't know where this is going. And it's a lot easier to sit in your office in a totally different city, not dealing with a fan base, to say, oh, well, they should do X. That is a very hard, complicated personal decision. And remember, these people know the guys that they're dealing with. Like, they like, these are more personal decisions for them than they are for fans or they are for media. Yeah,
and like, you know, that's something Sam has told me before, is that like he drafted James Harden. He didn't want to trade him. He drafted him. And you know, but like I'm you know, I've always kind of been of the same opinion you are, is that if it was me personally, I feel like, you know, holding on to Harden and then, you know, evaluating your options later was always kind of the most, you know, practical, best of both worlds situation. But again, I've always understood why Presti did it when he did it, to try to maximize, you know, the trade offer that he had at the time on the table. You know, you look at the fact of, like, you know, what happens with a locker room situation. You know, essentially James Harden had told the Thunder that, you know, he wasn't going to sign for less, you know, for the $5 million less in the summer. So like they knew, like, okay, we're going to probably have to, you know, move the guy. Like, they knew this. I mean, Harden and his representation had kind of made that clear that, like, we're not signing this deal. So like, you're going to have to move me. So if the Thunder knew that, and then they were going to have this kind of thing hanging over them all year, you know, practically speaking, you know, you'd have a similar situation that they had with Reggie Jackson, which did turn out to be a problem in the locker room before they moved him. So, you know, these are the things that they're like thinking about, while I'm sitting here like you. I'm kind of like, I don't know. It seems like you could have maybe gotten, you know, the best of both worlds if you just would have hung on to him. But, you know, that's just me, and I'm just a dumb guy sitting here talking into a microphone.
So when we get into what they have to do this summer outside of Westbrook, I think priority one is dealing with Andre Roberson. And the challenge of restricted free agency is always that you have to deal with the team that likes a player the most. You're not dealing with 25 NBA teams. You're dealing with 2 or 3 max. Like, that's all. That's all that really matters in this. And they have to kind of deal with that. And part of what being a good front office executive is knowing where your lines are. And I think that's probably the story with Roberson, because since he's not a true max guy, and I don't think anybody would ever say that he is, you have to figure out where that is, and also be willing to say, okay, this is what happens if it gets past that. And the test case here is Portland. You know, Portland, I don't know if they drew lines in the sand and Alan Crabb's big contract just didn't reach it, or whether they kind of got pulled in. They have a billionaire owner who said, okay, well, let's do it. But look at where they are now. Like, that team has no flexibility, and Oklahoma City can't afford to be in that circumstance when they have a mega star in his prime.
Yeah, and I think the question that they're asking themselves, Danny, is that, like, does Andre Roberson fit with a Westbrook team? And you know, Roberson, anybody that pays attention to the NBA would, you know, obviously understands that the guy is one of the truly elite wing defenders in the game. And, you know, he might get enough votes to make second team all defense this year even. I mean, the guy is a wonderful, wonderful wing defender, and that's a commodity in today's NBA with the game being so perimeter oriented. But at the same time, you look at, like, Roberson made sense with Durant and Westbrook, two of the 5 best offensive players in the world, compensating for his deficiencies. So yeah, he was a specialist, and he was like a closer that could come in and had 2 really, really good pitches and could get people out. But now with the Westbrook team, and the evidence that they've built over this season and the information they have, does Roberson fit with that? So I think that's question one that they got to ask themselves. And then, then you start factoring in the money, and that's what restricted free agency. That's why to me, it's such a fun thing, is because like you said, you're asking yourself, where am I going to go with this? It's almost like, negotiating to buy a house or buy a car or something. It's like you got the offer on the table. All you got to do is sign your name to it. And it's like, okay, so somebody's offered Andre Roberson $12 million a year. And maybe as an organization, the Thunder earmarked it at $10 million. We're going to do 10 a year for Roberson. That's what fits in our long-term planning. And it's like, well, now you're asking yourself, do we want to have him or want to not have him? Because it's one or the other. Either we pay him $2 million extra a year and we have him, or we say no and we no longer have this player for nothing. We lose him for nothing. So I think that's what's complicated about it, and that's why I think you see so many players get overpaid in restricted free agency. The other team understands that. They're willing to probably overpay to a degree to try to scare off the Thunder, because the Thunder, everybody knows the Thunder like Andre Roberson. They want to keep him. But it's about, is the price right? And to me, Roberson is going to try to push to get paid. Something Presti referenced in his exit interview, that they're going to try to get a deal done with Roberson before he actually goes out and meets with other teams. They're going to try to satisfy his demands to keep him away from that restricted free agency cauldron where, he could just end up with any offer out there. Like you said, one team really, really likes him. If the Brooklyn Nets are like, we love you, we're going to give you $14 million a year. And the Thunder are like, well, crap, that's just way too much. The Thunder are going to try to keep that from happening. But to me, I don't think Roberson's given him any breaks. People forget that when he was the 26th overall pick in the draft a few years ago, he made the rare move of signing for 80% of the rookie scale deal, which is like unheard of. Nobody does that. Everybody signs for the 120%, but he did it to sign with the Thunder. And, it was kind of part of their deal of, taking him late first round where they did. And it worked out. Roberson's an NBA player and he's going to get paid now, but I don't think he's going to be cutting the Thunder any breaks this time around.
Right, and this is also where agents really make their money or earn their money, is the idea of, while they can't have direct negotiations with teams, they can have clandestine conversations that are maybe a little bit speculative, and they can have an idea.
Can answer a text message.
Yeah, and also the idea that, the Thunder having lines in the sand, and we have seen talented players agree kind of preliminarily. It happened, Evan Fournier did that, Chris Middleton did that. There are guys who take the security because restricted free agency is also risky. What if you're just low enough on a lot of people's lists, and restricted free agents are always late in line because of the structure of the format. You can't sign an offer sheet during the moratorium. So you're sitting there going, well, maybe some team's going to offer me $14 million, but if they can get X player for 5 days ahead of time without the risk that OKC matches, if they do that, then they can't sign me.
Yeah, for some players it works out. I think that's a great point, because some players it really, really works out, where somebody is totally willing to overplay, like Alan Crabb's a good example, or Tyler Johnson, maybe guys that make more money than everybody expected. Then you got a good example of the other side is Dion Waiters. He was a restricted free agent entering last summer, and people were earmarking him after a really solid postseason run of maybe Dion Waiters is a $15 million a year player. And, all these players are signing and nobody else is really liking them, and time is passing, and, July 10th, July 12th, July 14th, nobody signed Waiters yet. And suddenly, his market is just completely diminished because everybody's cap space is spent and nobody really wanted to pony up and pay him. So, he goes to Miami for a cheap, short-term contract.
Same thing happened to Jared Sullinger and Tyler Zeller. It just happens. There are guys who get put on the wayside a little bit. It's easier for wings just because there are so few and they're always in great demand, but it's still possible. And there's a lot less money around the league right now than there was before. So
it's a risk.
It's a risk. Speaking of risk, this, other than of course the Westbrook thing because it's just so huge, I'm going to write on this probably for the Sporting News in the next couple of days. I've been working on an idea in my head of how to phrase it for a while. The Jerami Grant situation is so fun because what happens with Jerami Grant is he has basically the team has a decision here where basically if they let, I believe it's a team option. Do you know that?
Yes, yeah, team option, yeah.
Yeah, so the reason it's a team option is because if it was non-guaranteed, then you could cut him and somebody else could claim it. With a team option, if you decline it, then they go into this process. So Jerami Grant has a contract worth about $1.5 million for next year, which is incredible value for him. Whatever you think of Jerami Grant, I'm not the biggest fan in the world. He's still a steal at $1.5 million.
Right.
But the problem is, if you pick up that option, he is an unrestricted free agent. If you decline that option, he is a restricted free agent, and all of what we just talked about with Andre Roberson comes into play. And I'm just so intrigued by what they're gonna do there.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's them making it a statement of, we think you're part of the long term versus we don't think you're part of the long term. I mean, or we're skeptical. Maybe they're not saying we don't think you are. We're just at least skeptical about it. And I don't know. I don't really have much insight into that and what they're necessarily thinking. I know they like Jerami Grant. I think that, as many people in the front office have told me, is that he fits their profile. They feel like, he's young, he's athletic, versatile, plays multiple positions. I think Grant improved in a number of different ways this year. Shot the corner three really, really well, which was really surprising. But there's also reasons to kind of wonder about the guy as, a well-paid player, in terms of is this somebody that you can play much more than 20 minutes a game? Can you really play him stretch 4 minutes, which I think is probably his kind of future with the Thunder, especially if you keep Roberson, or you feel maybe you don't keep Roberson, but it's a clear hole the Thunder are looking to fill with that small forward position with somebody out there. And if you do that, where does Jerami Grant? Are you really going to pay well for a backup guy to that? Or if you don't believe him at the 4 for extended minutes, do you really want to pay him, especially when you've got Domantas Sabonis and a lot of interior players already that you're high on? So yeah, I mean, it's one of those fun things, Danny, I feel like happens a lot throughout the summer, and there's so many situations like this where it's like these under the radar moves that only like the kind of the NBA junkies really pay attention to, but they're really fascinating to see and kind of get a glimpse into front office thinking and kind of the small finer detailed decisions that everybody has to make.
It's also a great three-dimensional chess play, because you can also think about the idea that maybe him being a restricted free agent really limits his market this summer, because the Thunder making that choice and sacrificing, that probably makes their team more expensive for the 2017-18 season.
Right.
That might scare teams off. And so if it scares teams off, then maybe you get into a Dion Waiters situation where you just start freaking everyone out, and that chills his market, and it's actually easier because he loses so much leverage by doing it that way. And so, if, let's say, I know you're what you said, and I agree with it, is that the Thunder are worried about paying him big money, but if the well starts drying up and you start thinking oh my God, can we get him for $6 or $7 million a year? If it gets down there, then they should be high-fiving each other. Basically what happens is what was a huge risk, you turned into just a nice value piece, and then worse comes to worse. If you can get him at that price, you could probably trade him if you need to.
Exactly. And to me, I think that's probably where the Thunder's discussions are leaning, is they're probably saying, okay, what number can we get a guy like Jerami Grant at that makes him the most tradable possible asset that he could be, at high value trade? Because, they like Jerami Grant. They think he plays well. He's, like I said, he fits a lot of their profile and what they're looking for in a player. He was, kind of officially one of their first moves that they made, somewhat controversially so, trading Ersan Ilyasova to get Jerami Grant, but they wanted to get younger. Ilyasova's an unrestricted free agent this summer, blah, blah, blah. But, at the same time, now I think that the Thunder would view Jerami Grant as, they see him probably at most as a player to get to another player. As somebody to be a trade asset in a deal to kind of upgrade the roster at a later point. And within that, like you said, it's about what kind of number you get him at. If somebody's not going to want to move for Jerami Grant if he's on a, $45 million deal over 4 years. I think that somebody might be like, I don't know about that. That's a lot of cap space committed to Jerami Grant. But yeah, if you get him at $5 or $6 million a year, and it's a value contract, then now you're talking with something.
And as we discussed earlier with Andre, all it takes is one or two teams, though. And that's what makes GMs not be able to sleep at night, is it's a calculated risk, but it's a fascinating one.
Yeah, and that's what the Thunder, at the trade deadline, a lot of sources told me this too, is, they never there was teams interested in Andre Roberson at the trade deadline because, Presti has a reputation for, not letting players get to restricted free agency. Typically, you can go down the line with a lot of these guys that they've had come through, from Jeff Green to Reggie Jackson to whoever. Like when there's an uncertain future ahead and an uncertain number ahead, Presti often will move them for a controllable asset that he does have complete control over. He didn't do that with Roberson because the Thunder like him. And then also, but within that, they spent time trying to gauge the market. They tried to get as much as they possibly could to get a feel for like, what is Andre Roberson going to cost us? And I think, to me, the message that sent by doing their homework and fielding some calls about him, and then virtually, and then by eventually hanging on to him, is that was them saying that like, we want to keep him, but you got to wait and see what the offers look like.
Quickly, the other guys that I wanted to discuss briefly, we just talked about the trade deadline. The two guys that Presti got at the deadline from Chicago, Taj Gibson, Doug McDermott. McDermott is under contract, but he's extension eligible, and then Taj Gibson is an unrestricted free agent. Where do you see that playing out? Kind of where are the contours right now?
Yeah, I mean, Taj Gibson first. I think he just turned 32, and everybody that you talk to around Gibson that knows him well, he's looking for a big contract, as he kind of hits, the tail end of his career here. And it's complicated for the Thunder because I think Gibson, like I said earlier, he's a Westbrook player. I think that he fits mentally alongside Westbrook. I think he fits well. If this is just my opinion, obviously, but if Taj Gibson's on the Thunder from training camp, I think the Thunder are probably like a 52-win team, maybe. I think that they're clearly a better team with Taj Gibson as their starting four throughout the entire season. And, I think that they would love to have him back. I think he makes them better. But it's a matter of, how much is he going to get paid? He's an unrestricted free agent. He's going to talk to a lot of different teams. I think, Taj said himself that he wants to come back, but, every player says that sort of thing when they're sitting there in exit interviews. They want as much leverage as they can possibly get. And but he's an interesting case there because the Thunder have Domantas Sabonis, who had a very rocky rookie season, but they're very, very high on him. They believe in him as a potential solid starting four-man of the future. But whether or not he's ready for that, do you commit money to that? And I think it also filters into how they feel about Enes Kanter. Paying Kanter the money that he's getting, at 20 minutes a night. He played 3 minutes in the closeout game in Game 5. That's 2 consecutive playoff series, the Warriors and the Rockets, that Kanter basically became an unplayable guy, making $18 million a year sitting on your bench. So all that stuff kind of works hand in hand. And then about McDermott, they love Doug McDermott. I don't really expect them to extend him unless it's at a value deal where he's cutting a big break or something. But they do see McDermott as a long-term piece for sure.
And he opens up some different avenues for them in terms of a guy who can play 3 and the 4. He's not really defensively, but just in terms of doing some different things out there, and he can shoot. I think that having an off season with him and Billy Donovan will help him a lot, that they can actually figure out how to maximize what he can bring.
Yeah, so, and that's something Presti actually referenced, Danny, is that they see McDermott as a little bit more of a 4-man. He played it a little bit in that Rockets series. Not to draw just white guy on white guy comparison, but there is a little Ryan Anderson-ish. Ryan Anderson does a lot of things better than McDermott. He's a better rebounder, all that type of stuff. Better shooter too, probably overall. But I think the Thunder kind of see that. I think that's kind of the vision that they maybe have with McDermott is, what Anderson did for James Harden in spacing at the 4 position. Maybe McDermott can do that at least in spurts for Westbrook.
That would be encouraging, and I think it goes with the idea that the Thunder did go through their path this year because of necessity, and that when they have different options, and McDermott is certainly a different option, they can do other things, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, but I'm excited to see the prospects.
Right, yeah. I think that a lot of people, as you kind of put a bow on this Thunder season, and there was a lot of people that wanted to draw conclusions from it. To me, it just, at the heart of it, it was the Russell Westbrook experience, and it was about what he accomplished himself with a deeply flawed team that didn't really necessarily fit his skill set. And again, this is year 1 post Durant. I think people just have to kind of wrap their minds around that context. You referenced it. They got nothing back for the guy, a foundational Hall of Fame player. They got nothing back. You compare it to, if LeBron up and left Cleveland right now, he'd leave behind Kevin Love and Kyrie Irving. How many wins is that Cavaliers team probably going to win? I don't know, 35 or something. They're just, you take a player of the magnitude of Kevin Durant off of a team, and they are going to have problems. So to me, I've always seen this season that the Thunder had as fairly remarkable because they were able to kind of withstand and endure a departure of Durant's magnitude and still kind of continue on. But to me, this is when the evaluation starts for Presti in the front office. I give them grace for this first season because what else were they supposed to do? They made some moves. They tried to do what they could to kind of adjust and adapt on the fly. But now this is where they have evidence. This is where they have some data to evaluate what the roster should look like. And now this is where they have to start building their roster. And so I don't think you can evaluate Presti in the front office last season so much. This is when it begins for me.
I could not summarize that better if I had hours to plan it. So thank you so much for taking the time.
You bet, Danny. Always enjoy it, man.
Thanks again to Royce Young for taking the time to come on. You can read him at ESPN.com, and you can also follow him on Twitter at Royce Young. That's RoyceYoung. The Thunder story is just absolutely fascinating to me because of how they reacted. We talked about it a lot in terms of losing Durant for nothing, getting Westbrook to come back, and now it's not like that drama is over. That drama is just continuing, at least for a little bit, until we find out what happens with Russ. And I'm not going to do team-specific stuff all the time, but I do like incorporating it from time to time just to give that perspective. And the Thunder, to me, were the most compelling story of the 2016-17 regular season. So I wanted to do a podcast commemorating that, and that's what Royce and I have been trying to figure out the timing to do beforehand. And next week, we'll, in all likelihood, the current plan is to do actually something on the draft because the scout combine, the NBA combine is happening right now, and then the NBA draft lottery is on Tuesday of next week, so that provides a pretty good window. Still working on, probably going to have Sam Vecini on, still working on to see if I can either get another guest on top of that or do something different, but I love having Sam on, so if it's just him, I'll be thrilled. And lots going on. I have my off-season previews are now going up on Sports Illustrated, as cool as that is for me to say. It's a lifelong dream. And so I'm doing off-season previews for all 30 teams. I believe 4 of them are out when this gets released. The Rockets, the Jazz, the Raptors, and the Bulls. But there will be all 30 before the start of free agency. I think I'm about a third of the way through writing them, and then of course there's plenty of work in editing that amount of material and everything else. And then I'll have material for Real GM. I want to really get back in on the CBA Encyclopedia, and then I have a couple of extraneous pieces that probably will be sporting news, might be other places, and then of course my standard work at The Athletic on the Warriors, and then Dunked On with Nate Duncan, and then the Twitter NBA show, which we will be doing, basically for when there are playoff games that we are not covering. So you can check all of those things out. And you can also check out CLNS Radio. We're proud to be in the CLNS Radio family. They have an app. I use it. It's a nice thing I use it on my iPhone, so I know it exists on Android. I can't speak to the Android experience, but the iPhone one is great. It's a growing network of podcasts, including some on specific teams, especially in the Boston area, but other places, and then more general ones. Coach Nick's B-Ball Breakdown podcast is in it as well, so you can check all those out using the CLNS Radio app. And if you want to support this show, or really any other ones you listen to, leave a rating, leave a review in the podcast player of your choosing, subscribe, download every episode. Those things really do matter. And then check out our sponsors. In this episode, it is Blue Apron. Those of you who listen to the show for a while know how much I love Blue Apron, but it is an amazing food delivery service. Go to blueapron.com/realgm for 3 free meals, including free shipping on your order. And hopefully you'll love it as much as I do. I really do. It is something I look forward to all the time. And if you have any feedback on the show, good, bad, or indifferent, DannyLeroux@gmail.com is the best way, at Danny Leroux on Twitter. If you take the time to write it, I will take the time to read it, but I do not promise I will respond. And I probably don't have the time to do much of that, especially considering writing 30 off-season previews, doing some more stuff for Dunked On and everything else, and, of course, covering a team that's still going. So that's enough rambling for now. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, and make it a great day.